welcome to the Apfelstrudel making session. Apfelstrudel means apple strudel. It is a traditionally Austrian dish that is both served in the west of the country where I am from as well as in the east. You can eat it in a savory manner or in a sweet manner. We're probably going to do the sweet version today. So this is a recipe where I don't actually have anything written down. This is a recipe that has been passed down to me in approximation, and my grandmother and my mother always said that they feel it. I'm not sure I feel it as well as they do, so I'm a little terrified if this is gonna work. Also because elevation is different, flour is always different, I believe eggs are different, so I'll try my best. So what you have is roughly 500 grams of flour. It should be fresh flour, not flour that has dried out, because something that's very dry, and this is of course an issue in El Paso, makes it more difficult to create this dough. So let's try this. So this is the flour, and what I'm gonna try to do is intermingle this flour with 3 to 4 eggs. So that already is a little bit dependent on the size of the eggs and how well they incorporate. And could you give me a knife? Thank you very much. And I'm going to try and incorporate the eggs into the flour. My mom always did this with a knife, so that's why I'm doing it as well. There's different philosophies of this. I think my grandmother used just her hands. And what I was also told is that it's very important that not only the flour but also the eggs be very fresh. Of course, freshness to my grandmother meant that she had chickens in her backyard and she got the eggs from there, so no doubt they were fresher than what I can get. I'm trying to be very optimistic now. And because these eggs are a little bit smaller, I think I'm gonna add a 4th egg. And now is soon, I think, the point when I need to start kneading the dough. And we'll add incrementally is a little bit of olive oil. In the east of Austria we tend to use vegetable oils. In the west we tend to use olive oil, since that's closer to Italy and it's more readily available. So I'm just gonna add little pieces of oil and then water. And the water should be lukewarm. It always seems to me that my grandmother did this with closed eyes and it was super easy. And my mom did this while she was telling me stories or was helping my brother with his homework. So I'm exclusively focused on this and I'm still having trouble. And then what's equally important is that the dough rests. It needs to rest under a moist, warm towel for about half an hour. So now we'll begin with the filling of the Apfelstrudel as the dough is resting and hopefully getting to the consistency that we want. Again, there is no precise recipe. I would say roughly 5 to 6 apples. I chose Gala apples. They shouldn't be too sweet, but more on the tart side, have a significant amount of juice. And what I usually do, and I'm sure this is not the chef's way to do this, but I usually just quarter them and then peel them and then slice them in fairly thin slices, because you want to be able to roll the dough around it. So I already prepared, I think, 2 apples, so we're gonna add maybe 3 more to this. And then we'll proceed with the rest of the filling. So usually I'll just do it this way. I have a peeler, but for some reason I find it easier to do it this way. This also doesn't have to be super precise. My mom actually preferred it with the peel on. And those are organic apples, so it should be okay. But I just chose the somewhat fancier option. So they should be fairly thin. And then what you can also do is add a little bit of lemon juice to the sliced apples. Apples are a staple in Tyrol. They grow locally, also in South Tyrol. We have a lot of different varieties. My grandmother, when she moved from the city to a smaller place in a village in the surrounding area, actually had a little apple orchard, and we harvested our apples for the Apfelstrudel there, which I really enjoyed. My grandmother grew all of her fruits and vegetables when she moved to that little place in her 70s. And she was just a phenomenal cook, but also someone who knew how to save money and make the most of very little. And I'm always amazed how she was able to raise 3 children during the war. My grandfather was not drafted, thankfully, into the Wehrmacht. My grandfather was a socialist. So he had a clandestine life. He was working for the trains. He was a train conductor, and so they needed train conductors, and that's why he wasn't drafted. However, and I'm very proud of this, my grandfather refused to have his 2 sons, especially his older one, join the Hitler Youth. My mom's brothers were significantly older than she was, so my uncle would have been 15 at the start of the war in 1939. But my grandfather refused to have them join the Hitler Youth, and as punishment, my uncle was drafted into the Wehrmacht at the age of 17. And he was fighting on the Eastern Front, was taken prisoner, and returned home in 1953. So 8 years after the end of the war. And so these stories are important to me because I'm just 1 generation removed from the war, which I think is an experience many don't have, and I'm certainly grateful I didn't have to have it firsthand, but my parents both remember it. So these are the apples. Once we're done with the apples, we're gonna turn to the crumbs, the famous breadcrumbs that we also use for the Marillenknödel, which are my other favorite. Again, usually in Austria, I wouldn't buy the breadcrumbs. I would just use stale old white bread and grind it. The thought, I'm sure, from my grandmother that I would go to a grocery store and buy breadcrumbs would seem very absurd. But that's what I did for today. And then there's again two philosophies. The purists do not add nuts. So I think most Viennese would not add nuts to the breadcrumbs. However, my mom was very fond of hazelnuts in particular and almonds, and so she always added a little bit of ground nuts to the mix. And because we're in El Paso, I replaced the hazelnuts with pecans. Okay. So I think for now that's good enough. So those are the apples. If we need more, I'll add more. And then I'd like to turn to the breadcrumbs and the nuts. So now we're gonna turn to the filling for the Apfelstrudel, and we're gonna start with some butter, which makes every single dish better, I think. And again, this is a guesstimate, so I'm gonna start with a little bit and then see if I need more as I go. So we'll start with melting the butter and then add some breadcrumbs, again, which I purchased rather than grinding my own, which is what my mom and my grandmother would have done. So let's just melt the butter. And then here, what I have here are pecans rather than ground almonds or ground hazelnuts. And I just use a little bit less or a little bit fewer breadcrumbs, and the rest is made up by the nuts. Again, Viennese purists don't use the nuts, so don't tell them if you talk to Viennese. It shouldn't be brown yet as you add the breadcrumbs, but fully melted. Probably gonna use a little bit more butter. I like breadcrumbs a lot, some people don't. I use juicy apples so I can add more breadcrumbs because I just like the crunch. So we should ideally brown the breadcrumbs a little bit. And then, as they're starting to brown, also add a little bit of sugar. Some people add the sugar only as we roll the strudel. I like to add the sugar early on because it caramelizes it a little bit, which I think tastes better. So, as the breadcrumbs are starting to brown, I'm going to start adding the sugar. Again, there is no specific measurements, so I just add as I feel and then brown it together. My mom, when she used the almonds, she always used to toast the almonds as well. I probably won't do this with the pecans, but just use the breadcrumbs with the sugar to get toasted a little bit. And then what you can also add to this mix is a little bit of cinnamon. And more can be added when we roll the dough. So this is a quintessential part of all Austrian Mehlspeisen. And again, it's using what you have and not throwing out anything that might have dried out and can no longer be used at the breakfast table. Okay, so this should be about ready now. It's just a little bit browned, and the color is helped also with the cinnamon. Okay, and now I think we have about 10 more minutes for the dough to rest. What we'll also add are raisins. I know not everyone likes raisins, so this is obviously optional. My mom really liked cognac, and she liked to soak her raisins in a little bit of cognac. Some in the Viennese area particularly like to soak the raisins in rum. I'm going the Puritan route today, and I don't soak them in anything. We're just gonna put them in as are. And I chose this particular brand for the simple reason that Meredith and I are both interested in Chicanx literature, and there is a phenomenal Chicanx artist, Esther Hernandez, who created one of the most iconic images of the early Chicano movement when she renamed the sun-made raisins sun-mad raisins to draw attention to the environmental injustice and the toxins that so many farm workers were exposed to. Okay, so that should be about ready, and now I think we just need to wait for 10 more minutes for the dough, and then we can get started with the most exciting part and the most anxiety-inducing part, which is the rolling of the dough. So now the exciting part starts. We hope that the dough worked out the way it was supposed to be. We're removing the moist towel that covered the dough for about half an hour. So this is what the dough looks like now. It should be a little bit shiny. That's actually right. And I'm gonna use, as you notice, a towel. This can be a beach towel or a Turkish towel or a really big linen of sorts, but this helps us spread the dough hopefully evenly. So I'm gonna just work it a little bit more, and then I'm going to start and roll it. Now, in my grandmother's cuisine and in my mother's, this dough would be a lot more stretchable. This is in part probably because I'm just not as good baker, but also to an extent, again, the different elevation and the different way that flour and eggs merge here. So my grandmother always made the dough, not the way I do it right now with a rolling pin, but she was actually able to stretch the dough, which, as we see, this one is a little bit too dense to do that. So this is not ideal, but I'm gonna try and make it work. My grandmother stretched and rolled the dough so thin that she said you should be able to read the newspaper through it. Clearly that's gonna be challenging with my version of the dough, but I'll still try my best. I think it's just gonna be an El Paso version of an Apfelstrudel. So I'm gonna try and stretch the dough as much as possible. So now the dough looks like a big tortilla. It's not flawless. Again, this is not the kind of gezogener, stretched dough that I was supposed to do, but it's the best I can do for now, and I think it's gonna work quite well because, as my grandmother said, you need to be able to read the newspaper. You can't quite read the newspaper, but you can see the towel underneath, so that has to be good enough for us right now. I'm just stretching it a little bit more if I can to avoid it being too doughy in the corners. And then we're gonna shift to the next task, which is, as always, you start with butter, which makes everything better. And you melt it a little bit. If you're fancy, you have a spatula for this or a brush. I'm not very fancy today, so I just use my hands. So you cover it in a little bit of butter, that works. Then we add the apple slices. If you like, you can add some lemon, which is something that I actually find really tasty, and it refreshes the apples a little bit. So again, use apples that are not too sweet, that are maybe a little bit on the tart side. That should work nicely. And so you try to spread out the apples in such a way that you can still roll the dough fairly safely. So these are the apples. And next we're gonna add the bread crumbs that we toasted and added a little bit of sugar. So I'm gonna add those here. And then I'm gonna add the pecans, which again is an addition that I learned here in El Paso, because pecans are still fairly exotic in my part of the world. So these are the pecans, and you just crumble them this way. If you feel that it's not sweet enough, you can still add a little bit of sugar, but I think we're pretty good with the sweetness level at this point. If you like cinnamon, at this point you can still add a little bit of cinnamon to the mix, which we already added to the breadcrumbs. And last but not least, we add the sun-mad raisins. Hopefully people have much better working conditions there right now than they did in the 1970s. And again, my mom used to soak these in cognac. You can also soak them in rum. I have not tried mezcal, not sure if that works, but they add a little bit of a tang to it. And so now what I'm going to do, I'm going to remove some of these items so I can roll the dough with the help of this towel that I'm using. Okay, so now we're going to start and roll the dough. Again, this is a little bit thicker than it should be ideally, but it's the El Paso version of the Apfelstrudel. And so the hardest part in some ways is to get it to stick together. You can always add a little bit of butter, which is going to help to glue a little bit and also to brown the dough as we put it in the oven. We're gonna heat the oven to 450 degrees Celsius. So see, this should not be that doughy. In a thinner dough, you have, of course, more layers and you have less dough in the corners. So that's my imperfect version. And then we're gonna transport the dough and transfer it to wherever we're gonna bake it. So I'm just gonna get that real quick and then come back. I'm gonna use this pan and coat it with some butter. If you're more health and calorie conscious, you can also use some paper. What is that paper called? That like thin paper that you can use for baking. That's also not parchment paper. You can also use parchment paper, but I'm doing the traditional Austrian way with a lot of butter. And now what we're gonna try to do is transfer the dough from the towel to the pan. And ideally it should fit, which it sort of does. So this is as good as it's gonna get. My grandmother did always a U-shaped form, and my mom was super fancy and created an S-shaped form. I am not that successful with the dough, but if you really want to challenge yourself, that's what you can do. So I'm gonna add some more butter, so it's gonna brown as it bakes. And again, it's gonna bake for about half an hour, maybe a little bit longer because the dough is a little bit thicker. at 450 degrees Fahrenheit. And then we're gonna serve it, and you can serve it either with whipping cream, which is my preferred style, or you can serve it with vanilla cream, or you can serve it with ice cream. All of those variations are possible. And you usually drink coffee with it, because this is oftentimes a dessert, but if you, for example, mix it, especially during Lent, with potato soup, then it actually makes a lunch or a dinner a full meal. So let's put it in the oven. Put it in there for probably half an hour, maybe a little bit longer, depending on how big the piece is and how thick the dough is. So now all we can do is wait. We're gonna cut the Apfelstrudel, which has been in the oven for a little over half an hour, and let's hope that it worked out. So I'm gonna cut right here, and then hopefully it is cooked all the way through. I'm gonna cut here. Hold on. That's the Apfelstrudel. I like to serve it with a little bit of whipped cream, which I'm gonna get in a moment. And I hope it's cooked all the way through. It looks pretty good. And of course, what is also important is that you add a little bit of powdered sugar. And I'm gonna serve the whipped cream. So everyone gets a little dollop. Ideally this is chilled before you serve it. And if you have a sweet tooth, of course, you can also add more powdered sugar to the whipped cream. Bon appetit! Okay, I'm gonna try it now. Worked out pretty well. It's nice and sweet, not too sweet though. And the layers of the dough, I think, are cooked. I hope you'll enjoy it.